Okay, so welcome back, everybody. Welcome to the security stream. This is our third session of the day, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome David Schuhart from Broadcom for our next session. So David has actually pre-recorded his session, and which we're going to replay from my laptop. But if you've got any questions as the session is running, please do post those in the chat, and then we'll read those out afterwards. And of course, at the end of the session, you can unmute your line if you want to, and we can take your questions that way as well. So I hope you enjoy it. I'm going to play, and I'll go quiet now, and just give me a moment just so I can switch off some things so you can't hear me or see me, and enjoy the session. Thank you, David.
Thanks, Jamie. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending where you are in the world. My name is David Schuhart. I am the offering manager for the mainframe security portfolio at Broadcom. Today is a session, GSE UK Virtual Conference 2023. It is SOX, GDPR, EO, DORA, regulations giving you headaches. This is, again, a 2023 GSE virtual session, and it is session number 7H. There will be an assessment at the end with some questions to answer about how I did today and the content that was covered. Also a QR code that you can use to jump straight to the right survey. But again, in case you lose that, this is session 7H. So let's take a quick look at the agenda for today. First off, why do we even have compliance laws and regulations? It'd be good to level set on why we have them and, in general, why they're a good thing. The alphabet soup of regulations. So as you probably got a preview from the title, there are 4 that we'll be taking a closer look at today. That is SOX, GDPR, EO, and DORA. But there are also plenty of others out there that cover various industries that are kind of fun to look at just because you do really get an alphabet soup of regulations. So we'll just take a kind of do a little mini game with those. We'll take a closer look at the 4 regulations in the title, and we'll look at their advent. How did they come into being? We'll look at what they cover, and we'll look at the penalties for not following them. We'll look for common themes between them. So is there any common thread, any common action that we can pull out of those? And then finally, we'll do just that. We'll look at translating those regulatory themes into actions. And the idea is that you can get the biggest bang for your buck, right? So for time investment, what's the biggest benefit that you can get with the least amount of effort by if you can identify the themes between these regulations and you attack those, you can get broad coverage across multiple regulations. So first, why do we even have these compliance laws and regulations? And as we all know, it's to make more work for you, to take time away from your real work, and to give you a headache. Now, of course, we know that's not actually the case, but it's completely understandable why one might feel that way when you're having to deal with them. So again, those may be true, but they're not why we have the regulations. They are first and foremost for business protection, so actually protecting your business, and they are for consumer and investor protection. So for business protection, it's things like configuration best practices to make sure you have the most secure environment possible, and it's risk management requirements, both in terms of like change management and your issue tracking, like if you have open breaks, how you track those, how you close those, and making sure that your environment is as secure as it can be. For the consumer investor protection, it's about your consumers knowing where their personal information is kept and knowing that that information is being handled with integrity. So that will plug right into GDPR later, which is all about consumer privacy and making sure how the consumer knows how their data is being used. And it also relates to the right to be forgotten. And then finally, regulations exist because of businesses behaving badly. And you may think, well, what the heck does that mean? I have some examples later, and it'll become very clear when I give those 2 examples of what I mean by businesses behaving badly. So let's take a look at the veritable alphabet soup of regulations and compliance. So the 4 that are in the title, as mentioned, so SOX is Sarbanes-Oxley. GDPR is the General Data Protection Regulation. EO is the executive order. Now, that's a bit of a cheat because there are multiple executive orders, but there was one released by President Biden back in 2021 that was very specifically related to improving the nation's cybersecurity. And DORA is the Digital Operational Resilience Act. So for challenge mode, I have some examples here. That top one's probably the easiest. When this was done in live GSC, I had some Jaffa cakes to hand out as rewards for people that made guesses. Uh, Fortunately, I can't give you virtual Jaffa cakes, so I just kind of have to go over these. But I'll pause for just a second, think about what you may think what they are, take some guesses. Okay. Then HIPAA is the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, and yes, I'm having to cheat on some of these. Now, HIPAA, I do know, and that is specifically related to the privacy of health information. CTPAT or TPAT is the Customs Trade Partnership Against Terrorism. So that's regulations about its importation rules and things for going through customs and trade boundaries at the edge of countries. And then PIPEDA is the Personal Information Protection and Electronics Document Act. That is directly related to our friends in the Commonwealth in Canada, and that is one specifically related to how personal information is handled, but it again only applies to Canada. The bottom two are more obscure, admittedly. HIPAA is very taken very seriously here in the United States. The other two are certainly more obscure, but again, there's dozens, frankly, of regulations out there, and applicability depends on the technology and your industry and your location, right? But we'll take a deeper dive at the top four. So Sarbanes-Oxley, or SOX, and as you can see, I think I'm very creative by putting some IBM mainframe SOX here on the side. It is US based, so like how PIPEDA, as I alluded to, was based out of Canada. Sarbanes-Oxley is US based and mostly applies to public companies. It was passed in 2002, and as I alluded earlier to businesses behaving badly, that is directly exampled by Enron and WorldCom. So Sarbanes-Oxley, almost a direct result of the Enron and WorldCom scandals in the dot-com bubble burst, late 90s, early 2000s, right? And I think Enron and WorldCom are well-known businesses for all the wrong reasons. Massive fraud, and their accounting was basically intentionally misdirected investors, and it was covered up. A very, very big event, and basically led to the passing of Sarbanes-Oxley. So I will read directly from the stated goal of Sarbanes-Oxley, which is to protect investors by improving the accuracy and reliability of corporate disclosures. What is all involved here? This is requiring the CEO and CFO to certify the accuracy of financial statements. And it requires maintaining and assessing internal controls to prevent those statements from being incorrect from any way, right? So it can be intentional or unintentional, but if they're wrong, that's a big deal. So there are four main areas that those are going to cover for those internal controls. It's access, data backup, security, and change management. They're all very important, but what I've bolded as we go through these are kind of the common theme. So where you'll see these come up as in other regulations as well, and so I've bolded them so we kind of track them through as we talk about them later. So access and security are the two that are common for Sarbanes-Oxley. Now, what's really interesting about Sarbanes-Oxley is it's a great example of how regulations that are not directly IT related, this is not, if you look at the stated goal in the previous slide, this doesn't say anything about computers or how you manage your IT. It's all about accuracy of financial disclosures, right? So the controls around those financial disclosures and data retention and who can manipulate those financial disclosures, who can view those financial disclosures, those all play into them being accurate, right? So it's a great example of how not directly IT related regulations can have a huge impact on IT professionals, because it impacts how they do their day-to-day life and the standards they have to meet in terms of these internal controls as outlined by the regulation itself. As this is a European-based conference, I thought I'd loop in a little bit of soccer or football references here, but you'll get carded. So your penalties for not adhering to SOX, there's a yellow card or a red card. It directly targets senior leaders at the company. So that's like the CEO, CFO levels. It's the C-suite. As I mentioned, whether or not a mistake is intentional or unintentional is kind of irrelevant. It takes if it's an unintentional mistake. So if you certify a non-compliant report, again, doesn't imply intent, But if it's not compliant and it's certified, that's up to $1 million penalty and 10 years in jail for some of the senior leaders at the companies. And then if it's willful, so again, it escalates. Penalties for both tiers, but it's worse if it's intentional. It's a $5 million penalty and 20 years in jail for willfully certifying non-compliant reports. And I know from my background, I spent a lot of time as an engineer in the financial services industry. And just to go back to what I said earlier about how you have a not directly IT related regulation that impacts IT professionals, I know I saw in our change records, we had to put links to data sets that had SOX documentation in them. So this is a big one. If you're in the financial services, I'm sure you've heard of it. One of the premier regulations that we have to consider in the industry. Next, we have the General Data Protection Regulation. That is EU-based. That was passed in 2016, and that requires the protection of personal data and privacy of EU citizens. But what's worth noting here, and this kind of goes back to SOX, even if you're in the US, you still get affected by GDPR. If you're in the EU or if you're in Europe, you still get affected by SOX. And the reason why is because these are generally mainframe shops or large companies. They do international business, and basically, if you do business in one of those countries, you have these regulations apply to you. So GDPR applies to anybody that handles EU citizens' personal data. So if you're a US-based company and you have EU citizen data, GDPR applies to you still. So what kind of data? When we say personal information, some are obvious. You have your things like your name, your address, phone number, health info, web data, things that come immediately to mind. One thing I thought was interesting as I was looking at things, they're actually outlined in GDPR, written as something that's considered personal data. It's something like political opinions. That's considered PI. So very wide definition of personal information when it comes to GDPR. So for GDPR, there are several mandates. There is the individual consent mandate, which, sorry. These wonderful things, is the individual consent. So when you go to a website and you get this lovely cookie pop up, this is basically saying, this is the data we collect from you. These are the cookies that we gather, right? The individual bits of information, and what can we collect or not collect? So this is individual consent in action, right? There's the right to access, the right to be forgotten, data erasure, right to data portability. And so to run down those, because there's lots of rights to things. So right to access is right to get access to your data. So you have to give individual consent first and foremost, right? So for those pop-ups, those cookies, you have to give individual consent for your data to be collected. Right to access says that once that data is collected, you have the right to collect or access that data, right? So you can, saying right a lot, correct? You can reach out to these companies and ask for this data. So what do you have on me? I visited your website. I gave consent to collect certain information. What do you have and can I see it? That is your right to access. Right to be forgotten and to data erasure, you have the right to say, yes, I gave consent. Yes, you have this information, but I am withdrawing that consent and you must delete my data. So it is the right to be forgotten. That is to say, company that holds your PI, you can request it be deleted and it should go away. The right to data portability is similar to the previous one, but instead of your data being deleted, you have the right to basically have your data moved between companies. So if company A has your personal information and you would like to move it to company B because company A made you mad and you want to go do business with company B, you can request to have that data transferred. There is an expectation of reasonable level of protection for personal data. Now, I put it in quotes because reasonable for GDPR is not particularly well defined, quite frankly. So reasonable is open for quite a bit of interpretation. There is the requirement for reporting of data breaches within 72 hours. So this comes into play because 72 hours is not a lot of time. If you ever looked at the IBM cost of a data breach, it usually takes weeks, if not months, for a data breach to be detected. So the mandate to report a data breach within 72 hours is pressing and calls for a need for continuous monitoring, because if you are breached, odds are good you won't even know you were breached for the first 72 hours. unless you have appropriate continuous monitoring controls in place that will alert you to the potential breach. There is, and then finally, data protection impact assessment. So if a company that you have your data with, again, you say company A, company B, but you have your data with company A, they are going to expand their data centers. They're adding a new data center in a different geographic location. They are obligated to perform a data protection impact assessment, meaning what happens to the data? Does it get replicated somewhere else? Does it get moved to a different data center? Does it switch countries? You have the right to request that of the company that is manipulating your data. GDPR penalties. Again, the other popular sport I know in Europe is probably another one would be F1. So I figured I'd use a racing flag for this one. So black flagged for a penalty here. They are pretty stiff. 20 million euros or 4% of annual revenue, whichever is higher. So the largest fine to date was Amazon Europe at 746 million euros, which is obviously a ton of money. And even Amazon probably felt the impact of that. Going down the list, they are all relative, I suppose, less. They're still in the millions of dollars. WhatsApp had a 225 million fine, and you see it just goes down from there. Google at 90 million, Facebook at 60 million, then Google again at another 60 million. So, these are large penalties. These are big companies, and therefore their annual revenue is quite high. So that 4% penalty is pretty stiff. Next, let's look at EO. The full name is Executive Order 14028, Improving the Nation's Cybersecurity. As I mentioned, that was passed by U.S. President Joe Biden back in 2021, and that was in reaction to the SolarWinds, Microsoft Exchange, and Colonial Pipeline breaches, which happened in about an 18-month period around that time. There were 3 significant breaches. Right now, this does apply to the U.S. federal government entities only, and if you're a service provider or a vendor of the U.S. government, you would also be impacted. But as we see with the Department of Defense or DISA STIGs or Secure Technical Implementation Guidelines, those tend to trickle down. So right now, if you're in the government space or the government is your customer, you are impacted. But very often these things get translated into broader requirements and broader regulations that apply to more industries rather than just the government. As I mentioned, the Exchange, SolarWinds, and Colonial Pipeline hacks, I thought we would just talk about them real quickly. For Exchange, there were 4 zero-day exploits. So if you're not familiar with zero-day exploits, the idea of a zero-day exploit means kind of it was always there. From V1 of the product when it was released, there was an exploit that was available in the product, and there were 4 in Exchange. They were exploited to give full access to user emails and passwords. The hackers effectively had full administrative rights over the Exchange servers, so they could see all user emails and the user passwords, and they could also gave access to connected devices on the same network as well. So that's obviously a massive confidentiality problem. SolarWinds was a supply chain issue where SolarWinds is a supplier of it's Orion IT management software, and they are a vendor to other IT companies. And SolarWinds was breached. Malicious code was inserted into the SolarWinds product, Orion, and then that code was distributed out to customers, including some U.S. government customers. So the U.S. government obviously took a very keen interest in this. So this was effectively a supply chain attack, and so there was an integrity issue with SolarWinds software. And then finally, the Colonial Pipeline Company was a ransomware attack, and they supply about 45% of the U.S. East Coast petrol. And the ransomware itself, to stop the spread, Colonial Pipeline shut down their service effectively, and that caused fuel shortages from up and down the east seaboard. So obviously New Jersey's on the eastern seaboard going down, but even over to Texas, that affected availability of their services and had a very real impact on the United States and United States consumers because folks literally couldn't get gas. Ultimately, Colonial Pipeline paid a just over $4 million ransom to get the decryption key for the ransomware attack. There are several mandates out of the executive order. I will go through these quickly because there are several of them, but I will read through them pretty swiftly here. So there's the sharing of threat information. This is actually a pretty big deal because right now there are some it's like contractual terms and some government contracts that kind of restrict sharing of information. So that's actually one of the key tenets here is that the government entities amongst themselves and their vendors and suppliers should openly share threat information. So that's more known to the wider security community. It's the expectation that there's a modernization of federal government cybersecurity. So what's interesting here is this is highly prescriptive. So if we think back to the previous example with GDPR, it said reasonable. What the heck is reasonable? The executive order is not nearly that lenient. It specifically mandates, for example, the use of multi-factor authentication for authenticating users into government systems. It wants to enhance software supply chain security, and you can go directly back to the SolarWinds attack as to why that's that's a concern because the U.S. government was directly impacted by that. They would like to establish a cybersecurity review board, and that is internal to the government, I guess I should note. So that's not going to be an industry-wide or public review board. That's going to be internal to the government entities. They would like to improve detection of any breaches. So this goes back to the theme of continuous monitoring that I mentioned earlier. They would like to standardize vulnerability and incident response. So as you can imagine, it goes back to the sharing of threat information from earlier. You have these different government entities and their suppliers and their vendors, and everybody kind of has different standards on how to react to a vulnerability. You know, at what CVSS score, criticality of a vulnerability, do you take immediate action? What's your playbook for an incident response? Everybody had their own standards for that. You know, we love standards. We have dozens of them, that kind of problem. So the idea is to take a uniform approach and standardize all of that across all the government entities. And to improve investigative and remediation capabilities in terms of responding to any potential attacks. So there are two key tenets here, and it's really around logging. So about logging events, and they're kind of descriptive of what kind of events should be logged. And then those also mandate that those logs should be protected by immutable means. So i.e., you have SMF records. Somebody couldn't go in and have edit access to SMF to be able to go in and look at an offloaded SMF data set, let's say, and manipulate that data. So it says you should be logging, it says what things you should log, and it mandates that those log files should be immutable. Okay, so moving on to DORA, I know I kind of skipped over the penalties for the executive order. Part of the reason why I did that was because the executive order does not have very clearly defined penalties in it. So they're not like jail time, not like fines, but there are incentives, obviously, for these government entities to follow the executive order, as their funding is set by the federal government. As you can imagine, there is a financial incentive to comply. Non-compliant organizations or entities, excuse me, I'm sure will be getting attention in all the wrong way by the federal government, and I'm sure there will be budgeting implications if they do not follow the mandates. So moving on to DORA, it was the Digital Operational Resilience Act, and as I've said, I got DORA with red eyes over here. So this is not Dora the Explorer, this is Dora the Auditor. So she's a little bit meaner than Dora the Explorer. But DORA was proposed in 2020, and it was finalized at the end of 2022. I want to say it was November or December of last year. And I have the actual regulation noted here. It's very interesting, just a bunch of numbers, right? So not particularly memorable. But DORA is applicable to financial organizations, and it puts a heavy emphasis on third-party risk. So again, another theme that we're kind of picking up as we go through here is secure supply chain and managing third-party risk, right? As we saw the SolarWinds attack that influenced the executive order. Now we see again an integrity concern from a third party that is driving new regulations. DORA, even though it was finalized into 2022, just note here that it applies from January 17, 2025. So there is plenty of time for organizations to get compliant between now and then. DORA has several mandates, and again, I've kind of bolded the ones of interest here, but there is risk management tools, so that's systems and tools to identify and minimize IT risk on a continuous basis. So again, continuous monitoring. We have themes that we're going through here, and having basically a disaster recovery plan in place. There's incident reporting, which, as we went back to the GDPR requirement to disclose a breach within 72 hours, there are rules around how incidents are reported and the time frame in which to report them. So continuous monitoring would certainly help on that front. There's resilience testing. So again, it goes back to my disaster recovery example, but it is vulnerability assessments and scans, open source analysis, network vulnerability testing. So it basically pen testing and failover are the items covered in that mandate. There is third-party risk, which again, which mentioned on the previous slide, that is a major emphasis for DORA. And then there's information sharing. So this is directly related to the executive order, and that's a common theme, is information sharing amongst the disparate entities in the U.S. government, and then you have the disparate entities in the European Union. Everybody should be sharing information, so there's greater awareness in the larger security community. Again, with DORA, don't go much over the penalties. It's still new. The penalties are not well defined, but as we can imagine from the other examples, there will likely be financial penalties involved for organizations that are not compliant. So going through all of these regulations, and I've been trying to call them out as we go, there's definitely some themes we could pick out here. And this is not comprehensive, honestly, by any means. We have a limited amount of time to discuss today, but I tried to pick some of the ones that either applied to 3 or 4 of the regulations. So we see a need for stronger authentication, which applies to all 4. We see a need for continuous monitoring, which applies to basically everything except Sarbanes-Oxley. We see a need to have shored up supply chain and third-party security. And again, that is everything except Sarbanes-Oxley. And then enhanced access controls and documented security configurations. And that is all 4 of the regulations that we covered today. So pretty good coverage on these regulations if we can make sure that we meet the requirements of all of these themes. So let's take a look at them and what are some of the actions that we can take to improve. So first, of course, stronger authentication. I have it over on the far left here, okay. That might be too kind, frankly. Passwords that are alphanumeric, 8-character, case-insensitive, what I would refer to as simple passwords. Okay, I guess probably too kind. It's the old state of operating. It's the way things have been, but it's not really acceptable in this day and age. For example, a modern graphics card can crack a simple password in about 58 seconds. So simple password, again, being 8-character alphanumeric. Again, modern GPU can crack that in about 58 seconds. So do we really feel comfortable knowing that we hold, the keys to the kingdom are mainframes, the keys to the kingdom for our organization, the mainframes? Are we really okay with having 8-character alphanumeric passwords there? Better is passphrases, or that is to say, more complex or not simple passwords. Those are alphanumeric. They can support symbols up to 100 characters, and they're case sensitive. They are certainly better. But one of the issues with going to passphrases is the issue that blocks a lot of folks from moving to MFA, or multi-factor authentication, is the same issue you run into passphrases, which is to say that many applications don't support credentials or password that is longer than 8 characters. So I'm personally of the opinion that if you're going to take the time to modernize your applications to support greater than 8 characters, then you might as well skip the middleman and go straight to multi-factor authentication. On top of that, there are multi-factor authentication solutions for the mainframe on the market that will return 8-character tokens to you, so you don't even have to worry about the modernization effort of applications. You don't have to worry about the length of the credential field. So I know a lot of customers are still in that okay state. I would propose that you skip better and go straight to best and look at multi-factor authentication for your mainframe, right? And for those, I assume everybody here probably knows what multi-factor authentication is, but just in case there's any confusion, it is a non-static credential, at least part of it is a non-static credential. And they are they have to be two or more of these things. Something you know, something you have, and something you are. So for example, a password plus an RA, like if you have an RSA hard token, those two items together are multi-factor authentication. The password is something you know, and the PIN, or if it's a physical token, is something that you have, and as well as something that you know because you have the physical token and you know the PIN that's on that. You put those together, that's your credential, and so that is multi-factor authentication. As I've mentioned several times, there are many more regulations out there than what we're covering in the presentation today. And what I wanted to do was just give a quick regulatory landscape, if you will, to show all the regulations that either mandate or favor MFA. So there's ones in here that we did talk about and ones that we didn't, but like PCI DSS, right? That's a payment card regulatory standard, and it mandates MFA. There are others in here, but if we keep going down the list, we see the executive order. It, as I said, is highly prescriptive. It does mandate MFA, and it also goes a step further to mandate phishing-resistant MFA. And then we have other regulations like GDPR that are favored when it comes to, or rather, not are favored, they favor using multi-factor authentication. And then we also have DORA, which favors using multi-factor authentication. So everything in here except Sarbanes-Oxley, like I said, this applies to everyone that we talked about today and then some, and we can only assume that this is going to grow because in general the entire IT industry is moving to multi-factor authentication as effectively the authentication standard. And this is just an example of why passwords are insufficient. This was a survey that was conducted, and we can see that password habits are not good. that might be too kind, but we'll walk through these. 50% of users use the same passwords for all logins. That's bad enough, in of itself, and that if your password were ever compromised, that in theory means that all of your accounts are compromised. But to take it a step further, because maybe we don't care from an organizational perspective at somebody's Facebook account or somebody's Twitter account, maybe we don't care as much. But if you look at the next stat, and that just over 50% of users use the same password for their work and personal accounts. So now we do have a problem. if half of all users use the same password for all logins, and about half of all users use the same password for work and personal accounts, there has to be some overlap where there are users out there that use the same password for all accounts, and use the same password for all accounts regardless if it's a personal or a work account. So now that is obviously a concern, because that means if you have somebody's Twitter or Facebook account compromised, and maybe they're bob.user@facebook.com, and then you have bob.user@yourorganization.com, it doesn't take a hacker a lot of time to work backwards to figure out that they might be the same person, and then just trial and error, basically, try the compromised credential and see if it works. And based on these statistics, odds are decent at least that it would. Going down the list, these aren't as impactful as the first two, I don't think, but in the US, we have about 43% of internet users that are sharing their passwords with others. Again, if you have shared passwords and the same passwords between personal and work accounts, that is kind of a recipe for disaster. And then just over a third of all breaches come from compromised or stolen credentials, and that's rising year over year. So as we can see, the passwords are no longer sufficient. We need to evolve beyond the password, and the regulations back it up, the ones we talked about today, the ones that reference MFA or mandate MFA usage, the kind of a survey of the market and user habits, it's definitely indicative that it's time for us to move to MFA on the mainframe. The other thing that came up is continuous monitoring, and we're going to look at some of the examples here of what we might want to look at in a little more depth. But there are some low-hanging fruit here. So monitor your ZOS system for changes, monitor your security system, so any of the ESMs for changes to configurations. You should be monitoring your users, and takeaway here is this should all be near real time. Like I said, we'll dive into the examples of what should be monitored in the upcoming slides, but the key point I want to take away, kind of emphasize with continuous monitoring, is continuous, right? SMF is much like the black box on a plane after the plane's gone down. I mean, it can provide useful information, but usually it's all after the fact, and you cannot take any proactive steps at that point, right? Continuous monitoring should be near real time, so the first time something anomalous on the system occurs, you are alerted and you can start taking preventative actions or start investigating why that happened. So it's really trying to prevent the plane crash, so to speak. That way the black box doesn't have to be referenced, right? So what kind of things do we want to continuously monitor? Your APF authorized libraries is a great example. There are several ways to do that. There's obviously the sys1 parmlib prog00 member that could be read at IPL time. There's the setprog APF command that could be used to dynamically add. And then, so those are probably, I'd say, the two most common ways when system programmers think about APF authorized modules and libraries. But the other two that are noted here are very important and kind of easy to forget. So you have an APF authorized data set. So you have a PDS that is APF authorized. The addition of a member to that will make that APF authorized data set, adding a member to that will make that member, right, now APF authorized, but it is in the APF authorized data set. Or even more kind of sneaky is that adding a net new member, changing a member of an existing APF authorized PDS. So what we've got as an example, as the screenshots here, so we have an IEFBR14 module that's going to be APF authorized, and then we see a little kind of sneaky tweak up in the corner, and it's that red highlighted box, the JSCB pass. That's a bypass and effectively allows you to bypass security on IEFBR14 calls. So somebody went in and snuck that in to an existing IEFBR14 module. You weren't continuously monitoring that. You'd have no clue. They could then invoke IEFBR14 while bypassing security. Another example of something that we should be continuously monitoring is system access. Put in here monitor users just to tie back to the other slide, but this is system access outside the norm. So this is truly like system entry validation, right? When we say system access, who's signing into the system when they're doing it. So watch for things like a high number of sign-in violations. If you see Joe user who signs in a handful of times a day with one password violation, then all of a sudden you see 3 or 4 days of consecutive password violations until lockout, which hopefully at your site you have that set relatively low, but that would be cause for concern. Access outside of a standard location. So if they sign in from their work site, 7 days a week, hopefully not 7 days a week, 5 days a week, then they suddenly sign in from Japan, that would be cause for concern because that's a regular geographic sign-in. Access outside of normal business hours. Now, this depends on the individual. System programmers might get called out on issues at any time, but somebody like a teller, if you're in the financial industry, a teller generally is going to be working at, well, banker's hours. So if they're outside of 9 to 5 on a Monday to Friday, that might be cause for concern. And then the other big one, and this really comes back to audits, right? This will ease your life in audits when you're trying to evidence continuous monitoring, is proof of that monitoring, right? So being able to evidence that you do have that monitoring set up. So there's tons of things you can monitor. We don't have enough time today to discuss all of them. There is a session later today hosted by Steve Hosey. That's basically what happened last night that compromised your mainframe, and that's going to go through a continuous monitoring playbook. So that's going to go into more depth over what you want to monitor, and it's product agnostic, so it's not a pitch. It's a playbook that can be put together for any customer using any ESM from any vendor that can apply those principles to their organization to get good continuous monitoring coverage on their mainframes. I strongly suggest, if you like more discussion around continuous monitoring, that you attend that session. Next is supply chain and third-party security. Again, this runs rampant through the executive order and DORA, all about third parties. It goes directly back to the SolarWinds compromise. And takeaway is regulations are your friend here. This effectively forces your vendors and your suppliers to do the right thing, right? That's the protection of your business. That's why regulations are good, is because it holds folks like us at Broadcom, holds IBM, holds any of your vendors accountable to make sure that we're doing what we're supposed to do in terms of supply chain and third-party security. So, for example, what should you be looking for to guarantee that? You should be looking for a software bill of materials. So think of that much like the ingredients list on a food label. It should list everything that went into making that, and it should give the consumer confidence of what they're eating, right? So likewise, software materials list everything that went into that bit of software and what are you installing or taking into your mainframe system. Everything should be listed there. The tools, the libraries, the services, everything used to build that software should be included. Customers should be monitoring any of the vulnerability exploitability exchanges or VEXs. And as you're looking at those, your mitigation process, so basically your maintenance process, how do you apply security fixes, how do you apply integrity fixes, should incorporate the common vulnerability scoring system, or the CVSS scores. And I would suggest that you set up a framework around that. So it will vary per site based on your industry, based on your site-specific requirements and your site-specific standards. But for example, anything that's a CVSS score of 5 or lower, you might consider not critical, so it just rolls out in a regular maintenance payload. Anything that's an 8 or more might be considered critical, and maybe that rolls out like a break fix, right? Actually, ad hoc, individually patched modules rolls through the environment in a break fix manner because the vulnerability is so critical. Now, again, I don't want to say what is right for your organizations. That's a conversation that you need to have with your technology teams and your risk teams and determine what's right for you. But there should be a common playbook that is set up at your organization on how to handle these kind of vulnerabilities. I do want to outline the two that you'll see at least come from Broadcom. IBM and the other vendors do something very, very specific, or excuse me, it's not very specific, very similar. First, you of course have the security integrity fixes, which you'll sometimes see abbreviated as SecInt fixes. And these will usually come through on SMPE reports. You'll see them tagged SecInt. There's usually not a lot of information. I think they also include the top level CVSS score. And this is used as kind of an eye catcher more than anything else, right? It's a quick and easy identification of security or integrity fixes amongst the pile of other maintenance that you're probably having to deal with. It's a quick eye catcher to let you know what's out there. The security advisories, on the other hand, are behind the support portal, and that includes more detail on the vulnerability. Now, depending on the vulnerability, you won't find step-by-step steps to exploit it, but you'll get the sense of the affected products and how to mitigate any potential exposures. So this is a lot more detail, and really that information is behind the support portal, so you'll view it through a web page as opposed to viewing it in like a PTF payload, right? Actually, like your hold data. And on the security advisories, you can also sign up for email notification subscriptions, which, regardless of the vendor, this is not a Broadcom thing, I strongly recommend you do. Broadcom has this functionality, IBM has this functionality. I'm sure the BMCs and other vendors of the world that have this functionality as well. Strongly recommend that you sign up for these. So for Broadcom, at least, again, the exact layout's a little different by the vendor, but the steps are very, very similar. So for both Broadcom and IBM, our security portals are behind your support account. So Broadcom, you only need a support account that you need to get into, and you can get to the security advisories. IBM, I think it's a step further, and then you have to have a support account, and then you also need to, I think you actually need to be granted access to the security portal as well. But principle holds, right? It's a web based site to go get all the information on security fixes, and you can sign up for notifications. So the steps for this, at least for the Broadcom site, is once you're signed into your support account, thanks to Embry for letting me definitely steal his screenshot here, but you click on your name on the top right corner, it'll give you a drop down, you see notification settings, you click on that, and then you'll see the notification settings for all of your products. So in this case, there are a ton. The list listed, we only got down to ACF2 ZOS at the bottom here. This would be all Broadcom products, and you just toggle that little slider for security advisories for the products that are of interest to you, and you'll be notified whenever there's a security advisory released for one of them. And again, emphasize, every mainframe vendor I know of does this, and again, please go sign up. This is so fundamental to making sure that you have the most recent security fixes across all your products. Please go do this. And then we have access control. So a little bit different from what I was talking to about system access, where it's like system entry validation, somebody signing in. This is actually access control to make sure that this is authorization, or the other one's more authentication. This is an authorization question to make sure that you are adhering to the principle of least privilege, and a user only has access to resources that they need to do their job at any given time, and they only have that access when they need it. So that's the top bullet point covered. Goes hand in hand, but taking that principle of least privilege and then kind of narrowing down the scope. Very specifically look at your ZOS critical libraries, like really carefully review those, your PROM libs, your nukes, those kind of library, it's this one nucleus, those kind of data sets, and make sure that those very specifically are carefully reviewed and extremely locked down, because of the damage. The blast radius on compromise of those data sets tends to be pretty big. There should be an evergreen or continuous process for removing stale entitlements. The mainframe has a bright future, but it is a platform that's been around for a while. So just as a natural side effect of that, IDs and entitlements tend to build up over time, and they can go stale as folks leave organizations or switch roles. So that cleanup should be done on a regular basis. There should be a comprehensive encryption policy in place and implemented, so using pervasive encryption to make sure that the sensitive data is encrypted and the access to those keys is very carefully maintained. That's the part that I think that tends to be forgotten, is that if somebody has access to an encryption key, they also have access to be able to view the data. So both your encryption keys and the data you're encrypting need to be very carefully considered, and both need, and the keys particularly, need to be very carefully managed. And then finally, appropriately manage and audit your privileged users. Your privileged users are the most powerful users in your environment, and they need to be carefully controlled and reviewed every time that they sign on and every time that they take action. Okay, diving into these a little bit more, let's take a look at privileged user management. As I'm running out of time here, I'll move quickly through these. So why do we need to have privileged user management? There are several problems for managing privileged users, of course. There's 24/7 privileged access on an ID is a problem. There is the very obvious thought that if an ID that is 24/7 privileged gets compromised, that bad actor already has the access they need to do a lot of damage, because the account already has the access to do it. They don't have to jump through any hoops. They just can do it immediately because that ID has the access. There's also the protecting yourself and your staff consideration, where it doesn't necessarily have to be malicious. It can be accidental. Situation where an engineer thinks they're on a development system and they issue a particularly disruptive command. They're trying to IPL a sandbox. I think even a step down. They think they're on a sandbox and they're trying to IPL, and they issue a ZNet quick or something like that to take down VTAM. And oops, actually, wait, I'm on a production system. And because my ID was 24/7 entitled and I had that access to issue it, I issued that ZNet quick on the production system, and I just caused an incident. So 24/7 privileged access, whether it's from a malicious viewpoint or an accidental viewpoint, is kind of a accident waiting to happen, quite frankly. There tends to be no or limited validation of business need for privileged access, or it's very limited. Just does a ticket exist, right? Or there's no validation. Anytime a user is escalating privileges or wanting additional access, they should be able to explain why, right? So there should be an incident or a change ticket targeting the right configuration instances, or the right LPAR, the right assets during the right time of the right severity to justify that access. There is an overwhelming amount of audit data. This ties into the 24/7 privileged access point. If everything you do on the system is lumped into one bucket, how can you differentiate between what is considered BAU, business as usual access, and what is privileged access? So as you're going through an audit or trying to do a post-activity review, how do you know what was considered privileged action or not, right? You kind of have to have tribal knowledge of things in your environment that should be considered privileged, but an auditor doesn't know that. So that can lead to a lot of confusion. And then finally, as one of the most common methods of privileged access management and privileged user management we see is vaulting. That is a problem with vaults. Is generally you get shared credentials is a problem with vaults, is that you have an account in a vault that works, and one day, James checked out the ID, and then the next day, Jamie checked out the ID. And then when you go to do the post-activity review, who checked out that ID from the vault when? When did they sign into the mainframe LPAR, and what actions did they take? Trying to trace that backwards. If you think working backwards from that step, you have the big pile of audit data. What's BAU? What's privileged? Let's say you can identify what's privileged. Okay, these privileged actions were taken at this time. Okay, it was under this user ID, but who had checked that ID out from the vault at that time? Then you got to go back another step. It just makes the management of privileged users and management of privileged access that much more challenging. So these are these are huge challenges around privileged user management, and you should be taking a look at how you manage privileged users in your environment and looking at things like making sure that you strip standing privileges off of IDs, that there is thorough validation of business need for the privileged access, that you can differentiate between BAU and privileged access in SMF records effectively, right? In an audit, can you easily identify what's BAU and what's privileged, and can you prevent the sharing of credentials? So those are the kind of things that you need to consider as you're looking at your privileged user management. Then for security configuration, so this is the documented security configs, right? And this is to establish a security baseline. So there are different tiers here. So there is your security baseline, which is the way it is, the way you're running right now in your environment. Do you know what the settings are on any given system? Do you know, and do you know why they are that way? Meaning, if it's not the ideal, why isn't it? So that's your current security baseline. Then there's the ideal, right? The gold standard, if you will, which is going to usually be built off of like distigs. You might have in-house like controls libraries or controls references in terms of what your own organization expects you to do. You might have vendor stigs you can reference, but aggregating all that information, you should have a gold standard. If in Nirvana, if you didn't have to worry about operating a business, you could just make these changes freely. This is the gold standard we like to get to, and you have the compare and contrast of those two, i.e., this is where we are, this is where we know we are, this is where we'd like to be, and this is why we know we'd like to be here. We source it from these stigs or wherever you might have gotten that information from, and you document those deviations and why those are deviations. There might be very valid deviations in your baselines. It could be that getting to the gold standard requires changing a configuration that involves updating every single user on your system, which could be tens of thousands of users, and it just the risk involved is low. The operational risk, the security risk involved is low, the operational risk is very high, and so there's a calculated decision to not implement that change. That's okay. As long as that is documented and understood, then you're good, right? So audits are no longer about making sure your settings are correct. They are making sure that your settings are what you think they are, but you know them to be, and why are they not this idealized state, right? And you have to be able to evidence that you know that it meets your baseline as well. So as I mentioned, the other bullet point, follow DoD and vendor STIGs. As I think with any vendor out there, I would say that, if there's any ever questions on best practices, don't hesitate to reach out. So in summary, regulations, while they are painful, and again, trust me, having come from a customer site that was a very heavily regulated industry, I understand the pain, but they are ultimately there to safeguard our businesses and our customers. So they are, believe it or not, they're a good thing. They're a good thing. Look for the themes, really what we discussed in the second half of the presentation today. Look for the themes across various regulations that are applicable to your industry, and look to get the biggest benefit from those changes, right? Find overlap. Start small and be specific, right? Time is the tyrant here. If you get to the point, just for example, like those baselines that we were discussing, if you're trying to pull those together the week before an audit, you're probably going to be sad. That's not the time to be doing it. Start now. Start making iterative progress towards these best practices, and don't let operational risk turn you off of these. Minimize operational risk as much as possible. Start small. Hopefully you can do very granular implementations for, like, for example, multi-factor authentication. Hopefully you can target 1 or 2 users to start off with, and maybe 1 or 2 groups, and you can expand that out. Don't get paralyzed though because of operational risk, or because it seems like too much, it just seems too big, right? It's too monolithic to that you'll ever be able to get there. Start small, be specific, and start getting momentum towards best practices here. And be proactive. New regulations are common, as we just discussed. DORA, right, finalized end of last year, will go into force in 2025. Those new regulations are common, so you have to keep your eyes and ears open, right, for anything new coming through, and then look for best practice guidances to meet these stricter cybersecurity requirements. So as I said, I know from Broadcom's perspective, if you ever have any questions or concerns about best practices, don't reach out. Don't reach out. What am I saying? Don't hesitate to reach out. Excuse me. Please do reach out. And I'm sure for the other vendors, that's definitely true as well. Okay, and as I alluded to at the very beginning of the session, here is the feedback slide. This is a sample of the questionnaire. I would keep in mind, or like you to keep in mind, that the numbers are not necessarily consistent, so a high number is not necessarily a good thing. Do read these carefully, because, for example, number 2 is about the duration. So if you answered 9, it means I went way too long, and I try not to do that. So do read these carefully when you're submitting them. The link is up there. QR code is there. This is session 7H. My name is David Schuhart. Thank you very much for your time. And are there any questions?
Thanks
for pointing that,
David.
Jamie. Guess I only have a minute or 2 left, but I can hang out if there's anybody who has any questions.
You can unmute your lines, folks, and you can also post questions in chat as well. Trying to find my video button. There
DORA is preferred, or MFA is preferred for DORA. Where my body was floating kind of covered the key down there, but if it was a circle, it was preferred, and if it was a circle with a check mark, it was mandated. Absolutely.
There was another one on there. I don't know if that was, maybe you mentioned about SOX, David, and there's SOX, isn't there? Canadian SOX. Have you heard much about that?
SOX. No.
Yeah. So the last organization.
I guess it's probably a good example of, again, how you have a regulation that then kind of starts trickling out into the wider industry. So I actually don't personally know that, Jamie, but was that Canadian SOX based off of the US Sarbanes Act?
So because the last organization I was doing some work for, the company that owned them was a Canadian company, and they suddenly had to be bound by SOX. So yeah, you're absolutely right. It's basically a variation of the main SOX controls is my understanding anyway. So but when you were listing those on that slide, I just, gosh, there's so much regulation now, isn't there? It's just a lot, and I don't think it's going to get any easier. It just seems like every year there's a new regulation coming along, and yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if you've seen Arrested Development here, but it's like there's literally dozens of us, right? That's
Yeah.
that's what it feels like with regulations now. There's just so many.
Absolutely. One question I had around, you mentioned about, MFA. What's your what are you seeing in terms of MFA uptake amongst the mainframe community?
It seems to have gotten a lot more traction in the past year and a half in terms of the velocity to move to MFA. We've seen a couple instances where and that's part of the reason why I said you probably want to skip passphrases. Most customers that start with passphrases end up having the issues you'd run into with MFA, so they just kind of end up skipping and go straight to MFA. The biggest hurdle we see, and again, not a pitch, but both Broadcom and IBM have, and there's probably other vendors too, that have MFA solutions that will give you that 8-character token back, which that has really helped, because right now the biggest issue, as I mentioned, is I have the CICS application, the terminal, the login credentials only 8 bytes. What do you do? And I have 36 of those or more. The development effort to modernize those is intense, right? So that usually tends to be the blocker. As the regulatory pressure is ramped up, as you see more breaches, that's the motivation. And then the technical hurdle about the character limit is kind of finally been cleared. So it's been pretty good pickup over the past year and a half, I'd say, in terms of the velocity.
Okay, interesting. Thank you. So just before we close, any further questions for David? Anyone want to unmute their line to ask a question? Feel free. I think everyone's probably eager, David, to get off to lunch.
No, that's fine. I'm just waking up here in the US. Everybody else is thinking of getting into their lunch, which I totally understand. I appreciate everybody being here. And Jamie, sorry we had to see you virtually this time. I enjoyed the in-person event, and hopefully see you live for next year.
Yes, and thank you so much for the your presentation. Really enjoyed it. And also thank you so much for getting up so early in the morning to tune in. So folks, let me just pop in you saw the slide, you know the drill by now with regards to feedback. So let me just post the link in the chat. So if you click on that, that will take you to the feedback for David's session. Be very, very grateful if you could just take the time to do that. As you heard David say, Steve Jose will be up with us this afternoon at 3:30 UK time with his session that basically follows on from David. So do join us for that if you can. Right now, it's just after 1 o'clock in the UK, and we've got a lunch break for the next hour, and we're back here in the security stream at 1 o'clock, and there'll be a session from New Era around the ABCs of ZOS pervasive encryption. So I hope you can join us for that. So enjoy lunch, or in your case, David, your breakfast.
Yep.
And we'll see you real soon. Take care, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.